Welcome to a new season of Decoding Disinformation. In this four-part series, we'll explore the challenges climate journalists face from disinformation campaigns targeting their work. These campaigns not only undermine trust in climate reporting, but also put journalists at risk by portraying them as legitimate targets for attacks by extremists and conspiracy theorists. In this first episode, we examine a striking example of this phenomenon. The disinformation that spread during the deadly floods in Valencia on October 29th of last year. The disaster claimed 224 lives, with 3 individuals still missing. Our guest today is Clara Jiménez Cruz, CEO of Maldita, a leading fact-checking organization dedicated to fighting disinformation and promoting transparency. She will help us unpack the false narratives that circulated during the floods, the attacks on news outlets covering the crisis, the key players behind the spread of misinformation, including influencers, and the impact these narratives had during a time of urgent need. Clara will also discuss the role of digital platforms, of social media platforms, played in either amplifying or mitigating these harmful claims. Join us as we explore the complex landscape of disinformation surrounding the Dana event, these floods in Valencia, with one of Spain's foremost experts. Without further ado, let's welcome Clara Jiménez Cruz. Hi, Clara, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, very happy to be here.
So to begin with, Clara, can you set the scene for us regarding the misinformation landscape surrounding the floods in Valencia? What were your initial observations and concerns?
So I think that when there's a crisis situation such as the Valencia floods, what we would expect to see is social disinformation, that one that is shared because there's a lack of other information because of the moment of huge fear that people are living. Then political lies, and specifically in this case, I think that the political level on both sides, on the national government and on the regional government, shared some misinformation of their own, aligned with their political strategies, I guess. And thirdly, conspiracy theories. The thing is that in this case, what we saw was a coordinated effort of disinformation campaigns running one over the other by both national and foreign actors. And it became pretty obvious pretty soon that this was one of the biggest disinformation efforts that we had seen within the country.
Let's discuss one of these specific like hoaxes. Let's put it this way, so our audience have an idea of how harmful, and vicious these narratives were. And I'm talking specifically about the conspiracy theory around the Bonaire parking lot, claiming that there were like 2,000 deaths that were not being, like rescued or like unearthed or like that their bodies were still buried. So first, can you briefly describe this conspiracy theory for those who are not familiar with the events in Valencia, and what made this particular hoax so potent, so important, and what different actors seemed to amplify it?
So basically, what the disinformation narrative was that there were 2,000 dead bodies in a parking lot in Bonaire, that the government and the police and the press were trying to silence, and that we were being lied at all levels so that we wouldn't acknowledge that 2,000 people had died there, right? The real story was that not a single body was found in that parking lot, thankfully, because they were evacuated before the parking lot flooded. This disinformation narrative is key because we saw more than 21 different contents, so different hoaxes circulating that contributed to this narrative. And what we saw there was that many different actors were playing a key role in supporting that disinformative narrative, so much so that it actually reached a very wide swath of population throughout the country. And a lot of people believed, and likely still believe, that there was an accusation from the government of that issue.
Sort of a cover up, right?
Yeah, that's it.
You were talking that this disinformation was spread, and also you mentioned it before as well, like the different actors involved, right? Like both from a national level, but also some foreign interference. Focusing on a national level now, and then we can discuss the foreign interference. But I wanted to ask you what kind of actors, were involved, especially because I was following Minor Beta case as well. And it struck me the fact that there were several quote unquote influencers disseminating this kind of false put directly. I wanted to say inaccurate information, but it's directly a falsehood.
So listen, I think we saw some natural disinformation actors, so people that we already know, or actors that we already know, that disseminate disinformation on a regular basis. Some of our anti-COVID conspiracy theorists took part in disseminating that disinformation. Some political influencers that are well known for the disinformation campaigns were also present. But because the topic was so sensible, and I also think because of how badly politically handled it was, this ended up being part of the general conversation. And we saw trend influencers, like style life influencers, also sharing this information. And I don't think that they were part of those disinformation campaigns. They just were fooled by those disinformation campaigns and decided to share it, even though they weren't sharing facts, they were sharing disinformation, right? But that also meant that those disinformation campaigns reach a much broader audience that on a regular basis might not be specifically interested in, for example, political issues, but it became an issue for them.
Let's focus now on the foreign interference or foreign, an influence. So you mentioned that among the actors that Maldita had identified were some foreign actors as well. I think that I read specifically, linked to the Russia, an ecosystem of accounts amplifying disinformation. How does this type of foreign interference, differ from domestic, disinformation efforts? And if you can describe a little bit more, whether that this Russian ecosystem spreading disinformation across Europe, not only in Valencia.
So my feeling, and I think it's what we saw in Valencia, is that foreign interference right now and FIMI campaigns are coordinating very naturally with national disinformation campaigns. So what we saw in Valencia, for example, was an amplification of a disinformation that was attacking the king of Spain when visiting one of the affected areas, that was amplified by the Pravda network. And it was pretty easy to track, and because of that amplification, together again with the sensitivity within the population, it ended up in an attack to the king and the queen during their visit. This is not to say that every other national disinformant is necessarily coordinated with the Russians, but it is that we need to understand that those disinformation campaigns are being run in parallel, but not without acknowledging that the other actors exist. So whenever a national disinformation campaign or a national actor lands a disinformation campaign, if the foreign actors or if other national actors think that they can benefit their interests, they will try to push it as well. I think that's the kind of coordination that we saw pretty clearly during the Valencia floods. I don't think that we can say that they have a WhatsApp group and that they do that kind of coordination because we don't have proof to say so. But I think it's it's quite self-explanatory to see that they can benefit each other and that they push each other's campaigns because they are looking for the same objectives, which at the end of the day is destabilization and destabilization of democracies.
Mhm. Yeah, kind of like by taking a look at the evidences that the evidence body that organizations like Malita, for example, collected one can infer that there is some kind of or organic coordination in pushing each other's false narratives, right? To reach a wider audience. Before we delve a little bit more into how these campaigns have targeted like other democratic institutions or Spain's institutions, such as, for example, the royal family, but you mentioned this quote unquote Pravda network. Can you describe for our audience what is this? What is the Pravda network?
So the Pravda network is a set of I don't want to call them media outlets, a set of web pages that look like media outlets across the globe in different languages and in different countries that publish disinformation regularly, that publish each other's disinformation regularly, and that are known assets of the Russian disinformation industry. So there are outlets that are listed that you know that they have Russian connections and that whenever they need to coordinate a disinformation campaign, they will all of them publish those different disinformation pieces so that they can create a conversation around it. I think, by the way, now that we're talking, it's interesting to see how the Pravda network is rebranding itself to do other things like LLM grooming. So lately, we've seen how the Pravda network has launched web pages in co-official languages that are more like smaller languages like Euskera, Gallego, and Catalan, in order to intervene in the results of the AI chatbots. So they're sort of rewriting the internet somehow.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, because it's actually literally flooding with falsehoods. Not only our social media platforms, but also the results of large language models. Like, come on, everyone is thinking about ChatGPT, but also Gemini and another language model.
That's it.
So going back to your previous answer, in which you basically mentioned about the attacks on the royal family. So there's also these kind of attacks to try to erode the trust of the general public in Spain against their institutions, and one of those let's say quote unquote institutions is the media in itself, right? One of those pillars of democracy. It's an independent media, and we saw how the porters that were covering, on the ground, the devastation of the flood in Valencia were attacked basically. So why do you think that these established news outlets, became targets? And was this a localized phenomenon or part of a broader trend?
I mean, I think this idea of targeting legacy media and credible media so far is not news. I think those attacks did not only occur to the public broadcaster; we saw them across the ecosystem. I think it has a lot of relation with something that some authors have called the autocratic playbook, as a way to undermine the credibility of democratic institutions such as the media. the government, the CSOs, the civil society organizations, um, in order to offer an alternative, which is not necessarily a democratic alternative.
Did you identify any specific narratives linked to the climate disinformation, to the denialist disinformation ecosystem? And my question basically is that was there anything unique about the media became a focus of these narratives during this particular crisis?
I mean, I think the very broad narrative that was being pursued with the disinformation that flooded the country during the Valencia floods was institutions are lying to you. You can't trust them anymore. You need to trust me. And these are all the reasons, right? So within that broad narrative, the media were being attacked because they were not reporting on what was allegedly the truth, which was not. It was disinformation, such as the one we commented on the Bonaire parking lot. But I think this applies to any kind of context in which you put media institutions as one of the pillars that sustain democracies, independent media institutions, and by attacking them and saying that they're not telling you the truth and that they're working with the government to try to lie to you, you undermine the credibility of the whole system.
Yeah, basically talking about now about this broader trend. So your work around the Dana event demonstrated how pre-existing disinformation campaigns had somehow prepared the ground for these narratives to take hold. In your view, what are the overarching objectives of these sustained disinformation efforts that we saw probably culminate, during the process?
I think that the general trend that we're seeing and the Valencia floods, because of the lack of political leadership, was a unique moment to do so, is that idea of disregarding the current institutions as not reliable, as lying to you, as trying to manipulate you, and giving you an alternative to those institutions. And at the end of the road, what we're talking about is democracy is no longer a system that works. We need to look for a different one.
Let's discuss the role of the social media platforms during the Dana crisis. Malita conducted studies on the platform responses during this climate crisis. Could you share some idea that emerged from that analysis?
Sure. So for example, we looked at TikTok during the floods, and we look specifically at the hoax that we talked about in the Bonaire parking lot. And what we saw was that TikTok had over 129 videos that accumulated to 120 million views on their platform pursuing that false narrative. And yet they were not being either taken out, which is something that I wouldn't support in any case, but at least labeled as portraying disinformation. And that it's problematic because it speaks to the lack of knowledge or acknowledgement of that disinformation trend existing within their platforms, or to the lack of will from the platform to try to stop that kind of disinformation narrative. That again, it's not only attacking a specific hoax, saying that there are 2,000 deaths there. We need to understand that disinformation does not work in the way that if it's saying a falsehood about democracy, hence it's attacking democracy, and if it's anything else, it isn't. We need to understand that disinformation tries to build mental castles with different kinds of assertions that will move people to believe specific things in the long run. And that is why these kinds of narratives being supported on platforms and not labeled and not alerting the people that are coming across them are problematic.
Um, can I ask you a quick question about the role of AI and all this? Meaning, were you able to identify whether there were many hoaxes generated by AI or not? Because
We,
it's,
to be honest, we didn't look at that specifically, so I wouldn't be able to give you any numbers. I don't think, out of what I recall of the type of disinformation that we saw, that AI had a huge part on this. We saw, I mean, there are enough national actors that were taking part in this, doing their own videos and creating their own content without the need of AI.
Mhm, mhm. No, I was asking you this specific question because I think that it also emerged from the analysis of the disinformation campaigns around the 20 European elections last year in 2024. That where we actually the community, the journalistic community, expected like a flood, never better said, unfortunately, of disinformation and hoaxes, generated by AI, and then we realized that actually there were not that many. So wanted to know your impression about this as
The
well.
thing is that, I mean, we saw some content generated by AI, but in general, it was content that you could easily tell that was generated with AI. And I think that is one of the strategies that we are seeing more and more often, which is not necessarily very high quality AI content, but enough to flood the disinformation ecosystem. And I think it's also a way of creating a distraction from organizations like Maldita, who might be conducting research or fact checking around the topic, in which if you need to stop to debunk all that shitty AI content that is going around, you might not be able to pay attention to the other important content. I think that's more the strategy than actually to make a very high quality AI deceptive content on itself.
That's very interesting because it's also a way to deplete the resources of the fact-checking community in order to respond to these emergency cases, right?
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Mm. And that actually feeds into the sort of extended, discourse in Spain, and something that we've also observed across Europe, at least, is um, that that also fits into the polarization, or has got compact into the polarization in different countries across Europe, is that this general discourse that claims that media is lying to you, that they are in cahoots with the current government, and or maybe linked to other global economic powers. They present journalists, fact checkers, as traitors or foreign agents, or not being patriots, right? So how pervasive, is this kind of narrative when it decide climate change? So my question here is, what could potentially be the impact of the eroding trust in media, especially during environmental crisis like the floods in Valencia?
I mean, I think it's super problematic because at the end of the day, the media is not in the best shape right now, right? So credibility of the media, specifically in Spain, is not super high. Um, and and let's face it, the audience that the media has is nowhere comparable to the audience that social media has. We see more and more people getting their news and their information from social media, and that is a problem for regular media if we start losing also um, the audience that were traditionally ours because they continue to think that we're not um, that we're not actually pursuing information and truth, but more support of power. Um, there's not an easy solution for that, but I think it is problematic not only during environmental crisis. I think any critical moment can be like that. And I think it has somehow to do with how information was handled during the pandemic. Sorry. It feels that we had already lost a lot of credibility, or the media ecosystem had already lost a lot of credibility out of the economic crisis in 2008. And I think that the pandemic um, put media in a difficult situation somehow, because they were being asked from the government to have a responsible position in the way they inform about the political measures that were being taken. And that meant not necessarily doing the full um, work of informing of everything critically.
Very, very interesting. Looking forward, based on the lessons learned from the floods in Valencia, but now that you mentioned the pandemic as well, what key challenges do you foresee in combating these and misinformation, and what strategies do you believe are most crucial for building resilience against this campaign? Of these campaigns, and I'm especially asking you because I know that Maldita has developed an extensive program on media literacy as well. So, yeah, this is more or less kind of an open question to close this conversation.
So I think that we need to acknowledge that the world has dramatically changed since January, and it's gonna continue rapidly changing, uh, specifically on the issue of disinformation. And I think we need to prepare ourselves ahead of the fact that the foreign interference that we were seeing from Russia and China may come from the US in a very near future if it's not already here. And that also means that we need to start thinking of how do we change our strategies, right? So let me give you an example of what Maldita is thinking about. Um, we think we need to make much more self-explanatory to people that disinformation campaigns are being run every day throughout our communities. And in order to do so, we need to share much more data on how that disinformation campaigns are being run, so that everyone has them accessible and can understand that those are the kind of narratives that are being targeted at the moment, basically so that they can identify whenever they're targeted at them. Um, in that sense, in the case of Maldita, we're going to change the way Maldita looks to be less a media outlet and more community-based fighting disinformation foundation. We're going to put all the data that we currently process in-house and then develop articles on a platform so that any citizen that wants to contribute to the fight against disinformation can go there, see what the trends are, see which kind of disinformation is circulating, help in the debunkings, but also get a broader understanding of what's going on in the disinformation ecosystem.
So we'll keep an eye on the evolving, work of Maldita that has been together with other fact-checking outlets in Spain, leading the charge against disinformation. I think it's also in one of the key aspects of these podcasts. It's not only to present, the patterns, but also the impact that disinformation can have, on the lives of people, and specifically when we're talking also about the climate crisis, no? So how these threats, how this eroding, trust in the media can have a direct impact on the way that we, as the general public, actually prepare ahead of any climate emergency. How do we respond? In many ways, not only like seeking for information, but also the way that we interact with other people's in it. So Thank you very much for joining this first episode of the season 3 of Decoding Disinformation. And looking forward to follow your work at Maldita. Thank you very much, Clara.
Thanks, Javier. It was a pleasure.